He sat high on his bench like a king on a throne, convinced his gavel was a lightning bolt that could strike down anyone he despised. Judge Harrison Vance didn't just sentence defendants. He destroyed lives for sport. He looked at the man in the orange jumpsuit standing before him and saw nothing but a statistic, a stereotype, a target. He thought he was about to crush another helpless life. He was wrong. He wasn't looking at a criminal. He was looking at Special Agent Marcus Thorne, the head of FBI Internal Affairs, and the microphone was already recording. The air conditioning in the fictional Oak Haven County Courthouse, Georgia, hadn't worked properly since the late 90s. The air was thick, smelling of stale floor wax, nervous sweat, and old timber. But the heat wasn't the reason people in Oak Haven trembled when they walked through the double oak doors of Courtroom 4B. It was Judge Harrison Vance. Vance was a man carved from granite and prejudice. At 62, he possessed a shock of silver hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer of disdain. He didn't preside, he ruled. In Oak Haven, the Constitution was merely a suggestion. Vance's word was the law. On this particular Tuesday, the gallery was packed. The humidity made the tension palpable. "Next case," Vance barked, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Deputy Carl Miller, who was known more for his heavy hand than his adherence to protocol, shouted, "The State of Georgia versus Tyrell Banks. Docket number 4492. Charges: aggravated assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct." A hush fell over the room. Aggravated assault on a cop in Oak Haven was usually a one-way ticket to a decade in state prison, regardless of the evidence. The defendant, Tyrell Banks, was led in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that was slightly too short for his frame. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and he walked with a slight limp, a souvenir, ostensibly, from his arrest 3 nights ago. To the casual observer, Tyrell looked like exactly what Judge Vance expected to see: a black man from out of town, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. His expression was sullen, his eyes cast downward. But if Vance had looked closer, if he had looked past the skin color and the jumpsuit, he might have noticed the intelligence in those eyes. He might have noticed that the limp disappeared when Tyrell wasn't moving. He might have realized that Tyrell Banks was actually Marcus Thorne, a 15-year veteran of the Bureau, a man with 3 commendations for valor and a law degree from Georgetown. But Vance didn't look closer. He never did. "Mr. Banks," Vance said, finally looking down over his spectacles. He took a long, dramatic pause, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, son?" Thorne kept his voice low, adding a slight tremble to simulate fear. "I was just passing through, Your Honor, driving to Tallahassee." "Passing through," Vance repeated, chuckling dryly. He looked at the prosecutor, District Attorney Robert Sterling. Sterling was an oily man in a cheap suit who had built his career on Vance's coattails. "They're always just passing through our nice little community, aren't they, Mr. Sterling? And yet, trouble seems to stick to them like mud on a tire." "It certainly does, Your Honor," Sterling smirked, shuffling his papers. "The state is prepared to show that the defendant, after being pulled over for a broken tail light, became belligerent, attacked Officer Reynolds, and had to be subdued." Thorne's public defender, a young, terrified woman named Sarah Jenkins, stood up. Her hands were shaking. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. He states that Officer Reynolds initiated the physical contact and that—" "Sit down, Ms. Jenkins," Vance snapped. The gavel didn't bang. He just pointed it at her like a weapon. "I haven't asked for your bleeding heart rendition of events yet. I am establishing the character of the man standing in my courtroom." Vance turned his gaze back to Thorne. "You listen to me, boy. In this county, we respect law and order. We respect the badge. You come down here with your city attitude, thinking you can assault a peace officer." "I didn't touch him, sir," Thorne said, his voice rising just enough to sound desperate. "I had my hands on the wheel. He dragged me out." "Silence!" Vance roared. The sound echoed off the high ceilings. "You will speak when spoken to. One more outburst and I'll have Deputy Miller gag you. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Thorne whispered. Inside, Marcus Thorne was calm. His heart rate hadn't spiked above 70. He adjusted his stance, feeling the tiny, wafer-thin recorder taped to the inside of his thigh, and the second microtransmitter sewn into the collar of his jumpsuit. "Keep talking, Vance," Thorne thought. "Dig your own grave." The hearing was a farce from the start. It was a bail hearing, technically, but in Vance's courtroom, it was a pre-sentencing roast. "Mr. Sterling, what is the state's recommendation on bail?" Vance asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "Given the severity of the charges, Your Honor, and the fact that the defendant has no ties to the community, he's a flight risk. The state requests bail be denied, or at minimum set at $500,000. A ripple of shock went through the few civilians in the gallery. $500,000 for a traffic stop turned scuffle? It was unheard of. Sarah Jenkins shot up again. "Your Honor, that is exorbitant. This is a simple assault charge at worst. My client has no prior record. The background check came back clean." Vance narrowed his eyes. "Clean? Or just lucky enough not to get caught yet?" "I know the type, Ms. Jenkins. They drift from town to town, causing havoc, leeching off the system." Vance leaned forward, his face twisting into a mask of ugly superiority. "I look at this rap sheet, or lack thereof, and I don't see innocence. I see a predator who's been good at hiding in the tall grass. Well, the grass is cut short in Oakhaven, Mr. Banks." Thorne decided to poke the bear. He needed Vance to be explicit. He needed the hate to be undeniable on the recording. "I have a job," Thorne said, his voice steadying. "I'm an engineer. I have rights." Vance laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. "An engineer? You? And I'm the Queen of England. You have the rights that I say you have in this room. You think because you watched a few episodes of Law and Order you know how this works?" Vance took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "Let me explain the geography to you. You are in my house. And in my house, when a fine officer like Derek Reynolds says you attacked him, you attacked him. I don't need a video. I don't need a witness. I know Officer Reynolds. I've known his daddy for 40 years. I don't know you. And frankly, looking at you, I don't want to know you." He slammed the glasses back onto his face. "Bail is set at $750,000 cash only. Remand the defendant to the county jail until trial." $750,000. Sarah Jenkins gasped. "Your Honor, that is unconstitutional. It violates the Eighth Amendment regarding excessive bail." "Overruled," Vance sneered. "And Ms. Jenkins, if you cite the Constitution in my court one more time to defend a thug, I'll find you in contempt. Sit. Down." Thorne looked at the judge. He memorized the face. He memorized the smug arrogance of the prosecutor. He memorized the smirk on Deputy Miller's face. "Thank you, Your Honor," Thorne said. Vance blinked. He wasn't used to politeness after a ruling like that. "What did you say?" "I said thank you for making this clear." Vance scowled. "Get him out of my sight." As Deputy Miller grabbed Thorne's arm, roughly to spin him around, Thorne winced, intentionally exaggerating the pain. "Watch the shoulder, Deputy," Thorne murmured. "Shut up, dirtbag," Miller hissed in his ear. "Wait till we get you back to the holding cell. The boys have a welcoming party planned." Thorne filed that away too. Threat of physical retaliation by custodial staff. The file was getting thicker by the minute. 2 days later, Thorne was back in court. This time it was for a pre-trial motion that Sarah Jenkins had filed to suppress the arrest report, citing inconsistencies. The courtroom was emptier today. Just the key players. Vance looked bored. He was flipping through a golf magazine hidden behind a case file. "Ms. Jenkins," Vance sighed. "You are testing my patience. You claim Officer Reynolds's report contradicts his radio call?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice stronger today. "The radio call at 9:42 p.m. states he was performing a stop for a broken tail light. The arrest report says he stopped Mr. Banks for suspicious movement and erratic driving. The dash cam footage mysteriously corrupted." "Technology fails, Ms. Jenkins." Vance waved a hand dismissively. "It happens. It's humid." "Conveniently?" Thorne spoke up from the defendant's table. Vance's head snapped up. "I thought I told you to remain silent." "I'm just confused, Judge," Thorne said, leaning forward. He dropped the vernacular he had been using slightly, sharpening his tone. "See, under Brady versus Maryland, the suppression of evidence favorable to an accused violates due process. If the dashcam is corrupted, then the testimony of the officer is the only evidence. And if his testimony conflicts with the dispatch log, his credibility is impeached." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. Sterling, the prosecutor, dropped his pen. Sarah Jenkins looked at her client as if he had suddenly sprouted wings. Judge Vance looked like he had swallowed a lemon. "You know case law?" Vance asked, his voice dangerously low. "I read a lot," Thorne said simply. Vance's face turned a deep, mottled red. He stood up. "Chambers. Now. Both counsel. And bring the defendant." "Your Honor, is that necessary?" Sterling asked, looking nervous. "Now!" Vance screamed. The judge's chambers were plush, contrasting sharply with the decaying courtroom. Mahogany bookshelves, leather sofas, and a smell of expensive cigars. Vance sat on the edge of his massive desk. He motioned for Deputy Miller to close the door. "Leave the stenographer out there," Vance ordered. "Off the record." "Perfect," Thorne thought. "Gotcha." "Now," Vance said, walking up to Thorne until he was inches from his face. Thorne towered over the judge, but he kept his posture submissive. "You listen to me, you sea lawyer piece of trash," Vance hissed, spittle landing on Thorne's jumpsuit. "I don't know who you think you are, quoting Supreme Court cases in my town, but you need to understand something. The law is what I say it is." "I thought the law was blind, Judge," Thorne said calmly. "The law isn't blind," Vance sneered. "It has eyes, and it sees that you don't belong here. You think you're smart? I've buried smarter men than you. I will make sure you get the maximum sentence. I will make sure you are sent to the state pen in Jackson, where I have friends who don't like people who talk back. You will not survive a year." Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, trembling. "Judge Vance, this is highly improper. You are threatening a defendant. I will report this to the Judicial Qualifications Commission." Vance laughed. It was a manic, terrifying sound. "Report me? Sarah, honey, I am the commission in this district. My brother-in-law runs the grievance board. You say a word and you'll be disbarred before you can blink. You'll be working at the Dairy Queen by Friday." He turned back to Thorne. "And you're going to plead guilty. Today. Right now. You're going to take 5 years. And you're going to say thank you. If you don't, I'll instruct the jury to find you guilty of attempted murder of a police officer. That's 20 years minimum. Your choice, boy." Thorne looked Vance dead in the eye. The fear was gone from his face. The slump in his shoulders vanished. He stood at his full height, 6'3" of hardened federal agent. "You're offering me a plea deal?" Thorne asked, his voice suddenly crisp, authoritative. "Under duress? Without the prosecutor even making the offer?" "I'm telling you how it's going to be." Vance poked a finger into Thorne's chest. Thorne smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "You really should have checked my background a little better, Harrison," Thorne said. Vance froze. He hadn't been called by his first name in his chambers in 20 years. "Excuse me?" "You checked Tyrell Banks," Thorne said, taking a step toward the judge, forcing Vance to step back. "But you didn't check the fingerprints against the federal database properly, did you? You just ran a local state check." "Who are you?" Vance whispered, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his face. "My name," Thorne said, his voice echoing with command, "is Special Agent Marcus Thorne, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Affairs Division, and for the last 48 hours, Judge, you have been the star of a very comprehensive undercover operation." Vance's face went white. He looked at the door. He looked at Deputy Miller. "Miller, get him!" Vance shrieked. "He's lying! Beat him down!" Miller reached for his baton, stepping forward. "I wouldn't do that, Deputy," Thorne said, not even turning his head. "Because right now, there are 12 federal agents in the hallway, and they are listening to every word via the wire taped to my chest. You touch me, and I add assault on a federal agent to your RICO indictment." The silence in the judge's chambers following Thorne's revelation was heavy enough to crush a man. For 3 seconds, Judge Harrison Vance stared at the man he knew as Tyrell Banks. He tried to reconcile the image of the scared, limping defendant with the steely-eyed federal agent standing before him. His brain refused to process it. It was a nightmare. It had to be. "Miller!" Vance screamed again, his voice cracking, desperation clawing at his throat. "Don't just stand there. Shoot him! He's threatening a judicial officer. Kill him!" Deputy Miller's hand was on his gun, his knuckles white. He looked at Thorne, then at the door, then back at Vance. Miller was a bully, but he wasn't suicidal. The mention of federal agents had frozen his blood. "Deputy," Thorne said, his voice eerily calm, never breaking eye contact with Vance. "If that weapon clears its holster, you will not leave this room alive. Put your hands on your head and kneel. Now." Miller hesitated. "Do it!" Vance shrieked, slamming his hand on the desk. "I order you." Miller drew. He didn't get the gun level. Crash! The heavy oak door to the chambers didn't just open, it exploded inward. A battering ram had hit it with such force that the frame splintered, showering the expensive Persian rug with wood chips. "FBI, federal agents, drop the weapon, get on the ground." The room was instantly flooded with men and women in body armor, MP5 submachine guns raised, tactical lights blinding the dim, cigar smoke-filled room. Miller dropped his gun as if it were red-hot iron. He scrambled to his knees, hands lacing behind his head, sobbing. "I didn't do it! I was just following orders! Don't shoot!" District Attorney Robert Sterling, who had been trying to blend into the bookshelf, suddenly found his bladder failing him. He collapsed into a leather armchair, hyperventilating. And Judge Harrison Vance? The King of Oak Haven stood frozen. He looked at the agents, then at Thorne. Thorne slowly reached into his jumpsuit, pulled out a badge wallet, and flipped it open. The gold shield glinted in the tactical lights. "Harrison Vance," Thorne said, his voice ringing with the finality of a funeral bell. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, racketeering, judicial corruption, and solicitation of assault. You have the right to remain silent. And I highly suggest, for the first time in your miserable life, you use it." An agent moved forward, spinning Vance around. The judge resisted, just for a moment. "Get your hands off me," Vance spat. "Do you know who I am? I am the presiding judge of this county. This is an illegal arrest. I'll have your badges, all of you." "Cuff him," Thorne ordered, walking past Vance to the desk. He picked up the judge's private phone and the ledger Vance had been writing in before the meeting started. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Vance's wrists that had never felt anything harder than a silk cufflink, the reality began to set in. He was being dragged out of his own chambers. Sarah Jenkins, the public defender, was pressed against the wall, eyes wide, clutching her briefcase to her chest. She looked terrified. Thorne stopped in front of her. He softened his expression. "Ms. Jenkins," he said gently. You're FBI," she whispered. "I am. And you're a hell of a lawyer, Sarah. You stood up to him when no one else would. You're the only reason we knew there was still something worth saving in this courthouse." I thought I was going to lose your case," she stammered. "You didn't just win my case," Thorne smiled. "You just helped us take down the entire corrupt infrastructure of Oakhaven County." Thorne turned to the lead tactical agent. "Agent Rodriguez, take the judge out through the front lobby. I want every camera, every civilian, and every clerk to see him in chains. Parade him." "With pleasure, sir," Rodriguez grinned. The chaotic scene in the lobby of the Oakhaven courthouse would be played on the evening news for weeks. Judge Vance, the untouchable tyrant, was marched out in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled, shouting obscenities at the news crews that had mysteriously been tipped off to be waiting outside. Behind him, Deputy Miller was weeping openly. D.A. Sterling was being carried out, his legs having given way. But for Marcus Thorne, the arrest was just the beginning. The real work, the excavation of the rot, was happening in the basement. 3 hours later, Thorne had shed the orange jumpsuit. He was now wearing his standard bureau suit, crisp white shirt, dark tie, shoulder holster. He looked every inch the special agent in charge. He sat in the makeshift command center, set up in the sheriff's conference room. Across from him sat a team of forensic accountants and data specialists. "Talk to me, Gibson. What did we find in the safe?" Thorne asked, taking a sip of black coffee. Agent Gibson, a young whiz kid with thick glasses, looked up from a laptop, his eyes wide. "Sir, it's worse than we thought. The black book you saw him writing in. It's not just bribes, it's a price list." "A price list?" "Yes, sir. Look." Gibson turned the screen. Vance and the sheriff were running a pay-to-play scheme on sentencing. If you could pay $10,000 cash, a DUI became a reckless driving. If you paid $50,000, an assault charge disappeared. But that's the small potatoes. Gibson clicked a file. They were feeding the private prison system. We found contracts with Secure Hold Corrections, a private prison firm 3 counties over. Vance was guaranteed a kickback for every defendant he sentenced to a term longer than 5 years. He was literally selling years of people's lives for stock options. Thorne's jaw tightened. He thought about the young men he had seen in the holding cells. Kids. First-time offenders. People Vance had thrown away just to pawn his investment portfolio. "And the land grabs?" Thorne asked. "Confirmed," Gibson said. "We found deeds. Vance would set bail impossibly high for landowners, farmers, mostly black and poor white families, knowing they couldn't pay. When they sat in jail, they couldn't work. The bank would foreclose, or they'd be forced to sell their land for pennies on the dollar to pay for a lawyer. Shell companies owned by Vance's brother-in-law would buy the land. They've stolen nearly 4,000 acres in the last decade." Thorne stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the sleepy town of Oakhaven. It looked peaceful, but it was built on a graveyard of justice. It wasn't just racism, Thorne murmured. It was industrial-scale slavery. "Sir," another agent called out, "we have the sheriff in interrogation too. He's trying to cut a deal. He says he has recordings of Vance explicitly ordering him to plant drugs on a political rival back in 2018. "Don't give him a deal yet," Thorne said coldly. "Let him sweat. I want to talk to Vance first." Thorne walked down the hallway to the holding cells. The local deputies, those who hadn't been arrested, flattened themselves against the walls as he passed, terrified of making eye contact. Thorne swiped his keycard and entered the solitary interrogation room. Judge Vance was handcuffed to the table. His tie was gone, his jacket was gone. He looked smaller, older, but the hate in his eyes was still burning. Thorne sat down opposite him. He didn't say a word. He just placed a small digital recorder on the table, the same one he had taped to his leg during the hearing. "You ruined my life," Vance hissed. "You ruined your own life, Harrison," Thorne said calmly. "I just turned on the lights. You entrapped me. It won't stick. I have friends in the state capital. I have senators on speed dial." "Your friends?" Thorne laughed dryly. "Harrison, by the time I walked in here, your friends were already issuing press releases distancing themselves from you. The governor just called the director of the FBI to congratulate us on cleaning up corruption. You are radioactive. No one is coming to save you." Vance slumped back. "What do you want?" "I want you to look at this." Thorne slid a photo across the table. It was a picture of a young man, barely 18. "Who is that?" "Another thug?" Vance sneered. "That," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "was David Elmore. He stood in your courtroom 4 years ago. First offense, possession of marijuana, less than an ounce, a misdemeanor anywhere else. You gave him 10 years. You called him a menace to society. He hanged himself in his cell 3 months later." Vance shrugged. "Weak stock." Thorne leaned across the table, grabbing Vance by the collar of his expensive shirt. The agent's composure cracked, just for a second, revealing the burning rage beneath. "David Elmore was my nephew," Thorne whispered. Vance's eyes went wide. The color drained from his face completely. "That's right," Thorne said, releasing him with a shove. "You didn't just target random people. You eventually targeted the wrong family. I didn't take this case because of the Bureau, Harrison. I requested this assignment. I spent 2 years building the cover of Tyrell Banks. I learned to walk with a limp. I studied your psychology. I came here for you." Thorne stood up and straightened his jacket. "We found the kickbacks from the prison. We found the land deeds. We have the sheriff flipping on you. And I have you on tape threatening to murder a federal agent." Thorne walked to the door and paused. "Get comfortable, Harrison. The ride down is a lot faster than the climb up." The venue change was the first nail in Harrison Vance's coffin. His defense team, led by the high-priced and ruthlessly efficient Bartholomew Stone, had fought tooth and nail to keep the trial in Oakhaven. They argued that Vance had a right to be judged by a jury of his peers. But the federal magistrate saw through the ploy. In Oakhaven, a jury of peers would have consisted of people Vance had either bribed, intimidated, or indebted. Instead, the trial of United States versus Harrison Vance was moved to the Northern District of Georgia in Atlanta. The courtroom was a modern fortress of glass and mahogany, air-conditioned to a sterile chill that stood in stark contrast to the humid, decaying swamp of Vance's former kingdom. By 8 a.m. on the first day, the gallery was overflowing. National media outlets jockeyed for position with sketch artists, but the front 2 rows were reserved. They were filled with the silent, staring faces of Oakhaven's victims, farmers who had lost their land, mothers whose sons were rotting in private prisons, and the families of those who hadn't survived the county jail. When Harrison Vance entered, the room didn't gasp. It held its breath. He looked like a ghost of the man he had been. The custom-tailored suits were gone, replaced by a drab, off-the-rack grey suit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost 30 pounds in federal detention. His skin was sallow, his silver hair thinning, but his eyes, those cold, predatory eyes, remained unchanged. He scanned the gallery not with shame, but with a simmering, impotent rage. Presiding over the case was Judge Eleanor Stern. If Vance was fire and brimstone, Stern was ice and steel. She was a legend in the federal circuit, known for her terrifying intellect and her absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. She didn't use a gavel to demand order. A single raised eyebrow from her was usually enough to silence a room. The prosecution's opening. The lead prosecutor, U.S. Attorney David Ross, was a man who spoke softly but carried a heavy stick. He didn't scream or pace. He stood still, looking directly at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ross began, his voice calm. "We often speak of the law as a shield that protects the innocent from the chaos of the world. But what happens when the person holding the shield uses it to bludgeon the people he swore to protect? Harrison Vance wasn't a judge. He was a CEO, and his business was human suffering." Ross laid out the roadmap, the RICO charges, the wire fraud, the civil rights violations, and finally, the solicitation of murder against a federal agent, the parade of betrayal. The first week of testimony was a systematic dismantling of Vance's empire. The defense attorney, Stone, was brilliant, objecting to every piece of evidence, trying to break the chain of custody, trying to find technicalities. But the weight of the evidence was crushing. The turning point came on day 4, when the prosecution called Sheriff Elias Pendergrass. Pendergrass, once Vance's terrifying enforcer, looked small in the witness chair. He refused to look at the defense table. "Sheriff," Ross asked, "can you explain the term the Thursday special?" Pendergrass swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was a code between me and the judge. And what did it mean? It meant we needed to fill the quota for the private transport bus to secure hold prison. If the bus wasn't full by Friday morning, the judge wouldn't get his full commission from the prison contractors. "So what would you do?" "I'd tell the deputies to go out to the poorer neighborhoods," Pendergrass whispered. "Find anyone walking, loitering, jaywalking, broken tail lights, bring them in. Judge Vance would deny bail, process them fast, and put them on the bus." Did these people commit crimes? Not really. But in Oak Haven, a crime is whatever the judge said it was. From the defense table, Vance slammed his pen down. "Liar," he hissed, loud enough for the jury to hear. "Mr. Vance," Judge Stern didn't even look up from her notes, "if you speak out of turn again, I will have you gagged. Do not test me." The heartbreak. If Pendergrass provided the mechanics of the crime, Mrs. Clara Elmore provided the soul. When the elderly woman took the stand, clutching a framed photo of her grandson, the courtroom fell into a reverent silence. "David was a good boy," she testified, her voice trembling but clear. "He had a scholarship to Georgia Tech. He made a mistake. He had a marijuana joint in his pocket at a concert. One joint." She looked at Vance, tears streaming down her face. "You called him a thug. You called him an animal. You gave him 10 years. You took away his future so you could make $50 a day from the state." "Objection," Stone interjected gently. "Relevance regarding the financial specifics?" "Goes to motive, Your Honor," Ross countered. "Overruled," Stern said softly. "Continue, Mrs. Elmore." "He hanged himself because he was terrified," she sobbed. "He wrote me a letter. He said, Grandma, the judge said I belong here. Maybe he's right. She pointed a shaking finger at Vance. You killed my boy. You didn't use a gun, but you killed him just the same. Vance looked away, feigning boredom, picking at a thread on his sleeve. The jury noticed. They saw a man utterly devoid of empathy. The star witness. On the second Tuesday of the trial, the doors opened, and Special Agent Marcus Thorne walked in. He moved with the precision of a predator. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored. When he took the oath, his voice boomed. U.S. Attorney Ross walked him through the setup, the undercover persona, the traffic stop, the holding cell. Agent Thorne, Ross said, why did you initiate this operation? Because the Bureau received over 200 complaints from Oak Haven in 5 years, Thorne said. Statistically, that is an anomaly. We suspected systemic corruption. We didn't know it was a dictatorship. Let's talk about October 14th, Ross said. The meeting in chambers. The defendant realized I knew the law. He realized I wasn't the ignorant drifter he had profiled. He panicked. And what did he do? He threatened my life. He ordered his deputy to draw his weapon. He stated, and I quote, I will make sure you are sent to Jackson. You will not survive a year. Did you record this conversation? I did. Play Exhibit 4A. The audio was crystal clear. The high-quality FBI tech had cut through the background noise of the air conditioner. Vance's voice filled the courtroom, arrogant, hateful, and undeniably violent. Vance's voice. The law isn't blind. It has eyes, and it sees that you don't belong here. Then the order to Deputy Miller. Shoot him! Kill him! The jurors recoiled. Hearing a judge order an execution in his own chambers was a visceral shock. The cross-examination Bartholomew Stone stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He knew he couldn't fight the tape, so he had to destroy the man who made it. Agent Thorne, Stone smiled, a shark-like baring of teeth. You're a good actor, aren't you? I'm a trained field agent, Thorne corrected. You lied to the police. You lied to the court clerks. You lied to my client. You falsified government documents to create the identity of Tyrell Banks. Is that correct? It is standard operating procedure for... Yes or no, Agent Thorne? Did you lie? I utilized a cover identity. So deception comes naturally to you? Stone pressed, pacing closer. You walked into that courtroom looking for a fight. You baited Judge Vance. You acted sullen. You acted suspicious. You wanted him to be harsh, didn't you? You manufactured this entire scenario. Thorne leaned into the microphone. He locked eyes with Stone. Mr. Stone, I drove a car with a broken tail light. That was my only bait. If a broken tail light is enough provocation for a judge to deny bail, violate the Eighth Amendment, and threaten a defendant's life, then the problem isn't my acting. The problem is your client's soul. Objection, Stone shouted. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Stern said, though she looked impressed. Agent Thorne, just answer the questions. You entrapped him, Stone hammered. You created a stress environment that forced a lapse in judgment. A lapse in judgment is yelling, Thorne said coldly. Ordering a deputy to execute a man because he knows your secrets isn't a lapse. It's a felony. Stone paused, realizing he was losing the exchange. He changed tactics. You humiliated him. You arrested him in front of the cameras. You enjoyed it. Thorne paused. He looked at Mrs. Elmore in the front row. I didn't enjoy it, Counselor, but I slept very well that night. The fatal mistake. By the end of the second week, the defense was on the ropes. Stone's strategy was damage control. Get an acquittal on the most serious charges, minimize the sentence on the fraud. He told Vance they would rest the case. They would not call any witnesses. It was the smart play. But Harrison Vance was not a smart man. He was a narcissist who had been told he was a god for 30 years. I want to testify, Vance said, loud enough for the table to hear. No, Stone whispered, his face draining of color. Harrison, absolutely not. You will hang yourself. They need to hear my side, Vance hissed. They need to understand the context. You're letting them paint me as a monster. I can fix this. I can charm them. I've won elections, damn it. This isn't an election, Stone begged. I am testifying. Vance stood up. Your Honor, the defense calls Harrison Vance. Stone put his head in his hands. Thorne, sitting at the prosecution table, didn't smile, but his eyes narrowed. Checkmate. The meltdown. Vance's direct testimony was slick. He played the role of the weary, overworked public servant. He talked about tough love and the burden of leadership. He almost sounded convincing. Then, U.S. Attorney Ross stood up for cross-examination. Ross didn't yell, he didn't attack, he just picked. Mr. Vance, you claimed you were cleaning up the streets. Yet 80% of your maximum sentences were for non-violent offences. How does locking up a man for unpaid parking tickets clean up the streets? It sends a message, Vance said smoothly. Zero tolerance. And the kickbacks from Secure Hold? Was that also sending a message? Those were consulting fees, perfectly legal loopholes. Let's talk about the thugs you mentioned, Ross said, stepping closer. You used that word 40 times in your private journals. Who are the thugs, Mr. Vance? Criminals. People who don't respect authority. People like Agent Thorne? Yes. He came into my town, disrespectful, arrogant. He said, yes, sir, and no, sir. He was polite until you violated his rights. Is asserting one's rights arrogant to you? Vance's face began to redden. The mask was slipping. He was mocking me. I could see it in his eyes. He thought he was better than me. Better than you? Ross paused. Is that what this is about? You felt inferior to a black man who knew the law better than you did? The courtroom went deadly silent. Vance gripped the railing of the witness stand. His knuckles turned white. I am not inferior. I am the law in Oakhaven. My family built that town. And you sold it, Ross said sharply. You sold it for stock options. I did what was necessary, Vance shouted, standing up. Stone tried to signal him to stop, but Vance was gone. The rage that had been bottling up for weeks exploded. You don't understand, Vance screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the jury. You sit here in your air-conditioned high-rise with your degrees and your sensitivity training. You don't know what it takes to hold the line. I held the line against the chaos. I kept the animals in the cages. The animals? Ross asked quietly. You mean the citizens? I mean the scum, Vance roared, his face purple, spittle flying. They breed like rats. They steal. They lie. If I didn't crush them, they would have overrun us. I was the only thing standing between civilization and the jungle. I did you all a favor. The echo of his scream hung in the air. The jury looked at him with pure horror. He hadn't just admitted to the crimes. He had revealed the dark, rotting heart of his motivation. It wasn't just greed. It was a deep, pathological hatred for the people he judged. Vance stood there, heaving, his chest rising and falling. He looked at the jury, expecting to see agreement. He saw only disgust. He looked at Judge Stern. She was writing something down, her face grim. He looked at Marcus Thorne. Thorne was just watching him. Calm, steady. It was the look of a man who had just watched a rabid dog walk into a trap. No further questions, Your Honor, Ross said, closing his folder. Vance blinked. The adrenaline crashed. He looked around the room, realizing the silence wasn't respect. It was the silence of a grave. Vance stammered. I meant... Sit down, Mr. Vance, Judge Stern ordered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through him like a knife. "You have said quite enough." As Vance stumbled back to the defense table, Bartholomew Stone didn't even look at him. He began packing his briefcase. The trial was technically over. The verdict was now just a formality. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Judge Harrison Vance stood. His hands were shaking so violently that his attorney Bartholomew Stone had to grip his elbow to steady him. The foreman of the jury, a retired school teacher named Martha Lewis, stood up. She didn't look at Vance. She looked at the judge. "Ms. Lewis," Judge Stern asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous room, "has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please publish the verdict." Martha Lewis took a breath. She unfolded the paper. In the matter of the United States of America versus Harrison Vance, on count 1, conspiracy to violate civil rights. Guilty. Vance flinched as if he'd been slapped. On count 2, deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty. On count 3, wire fraud. Guilty. On count 4, racketeering. Guilty. It went on, and on, and on. 42 counts. 42 times the word guilty rang out like a hammer strike. By the 20th count, Vance had slumped into his chair, staring blankly at the table. By the final count, solicitation of assault on a federal officer, he was weeping. Not tears of remorse, but tears of self-pity. The gallery remained silent, instructed strictly by Judge Stern, but the energy was electric. It was a collective exhale held for decades. Judge Stern removed her glasses. She looked down at Vance. "Harrison Vance, you are remanded to the custody of the U.S. Marshals immediately. Sentencing will be held in 2 weeks. Take him away." As the Marshals moved in, Vance suddenly snapped. He lunged toward the rail, toward the gallery. "I did this for you!" he screamed at the stunned crowd. "I kept order. You'll see. The town will fall apart without me. You need me. Move!" The marshal barked, dragging him back. Vance locked eyes with Marcus Thorne one last time. Thorne didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement that the debt had been paid. The sentence. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was full again. It was time for the numbers. Bartholomew Stone pleaded for leniency. He cited Vance's age, 63, his prior service to the community, and his health. He asked for a minimum security facility. He asked for house arrest. Judge Stern listened politely. Then she opened the file in front of her. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice devoid of warmth, "you sat on a bench and demanded respect for the law, while you used the law as a weapon to terrorize the vulnerable. You turned a courthouse into a marketplace. You sold justice." She leaned forward. "You gave a teenager 10 years for a minor mistake, a sentence that drove him to suicide. You stole land from farmers who had worked it for generations. You ordered police officers to assault citizens. You are not a guardian of the law. You are its greatest enemy." "Please," Vance whispered. "The court sentences you to 20 years for the RICO charge, 10 years for the civil rights violations, 5 years for the fraud." Vance did the math in his head. 35 years. He would die in prison. "However," Judge Stern continued, and here her eyes flashed with a cold, poetic justice, "the Bureau of Prisons typically decides placement. But given the specific nature of your financial crimes involving the private prison industry, I am making a judicial recommendation that the Bureau has agreed to honor." She paused. "You profited from the Secure Hold Corrections Facility in southern Georgia. You sent hundreds of men there to boost your stock portfolio. It seems only fitting that you experience the product you sold so enthusiastically." Vance's eyes bulged. Secure Hold was a nightmare. It was a maximum security warehouse for the state's most violent offenders. It was overcrowded, underfunded, and brutal. He knew this because he had ensured it stayed that way to maximize profits. "No," Vance gasped. "No, you can't. I'm a judge. They'll kill me in there. You can't put me in general population." "You are not a judge anymore, Mr. Vance," Stern said, raising her gavel. "You are inmate number 8940. God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none left for you." Bang! The irony of fate. The processing center at Secure Hold Corrections smelled of bleach and misery. Harrison Vance stood naked, shivering on the cold concrete floor, while a guard, a young man who looked bored, sprayed him with delousing powder. "Turn around," the guard barked. I have a heart condition," Vance stammered. "I need to see the warden." "Warden's busy," the guard said. "Spread 'em." After the humiliation of the search, Vance was tossed a bundle of clothes, an orange jumpsuit. He held it up. It was faded, rough against his skin. It was too short in the legs. He remembered the day he looked down at Tyrell Banks in his courtroom. He remembered mocking the way the jumpsuit fit him. He remembered feeling like a god looking at an insect. He pulled the jumpsuit on. It was tight. It smelled of someone else's sweat. "Cell block D," the guard said, buzzing the heavy steel door open. Vance walked into the block. The noise hit him like a physical blow, shouting, banging, the sound of dominoes slapping on metal tables. As he walked down the tier, carrying his thin mattress, the shouting stopped. It rippled down the line. Silence. He passed a cell. A large man with tattoos covering his neck was leaning against the bars. The man looked familiar. Vance had sentenced him 5 years ago. He passed another cell. Another familiar face. Word travels fast in prison. They knew he was coming. The king of Oak Haven was here. "Hey, Judge," a voice whispered from the darkness of a cell. Vance didn't look. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Passing through, another voice mocked, echoing Vance's own words from the hearing. "He ain't passing through," a third voice laughed. "He's home." Vance reached his cell. He stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a metallic finality that sounded like the end of the world. He sat on the cot. He looked at the toilet. He looked at the graffiti on the wall. He buried his face in his hands. He was rich. He was powerful. He was the law. And now he was nothing. 6 months later. Marcus Thorne sat on a bench outside the Oak Haven courthouse. The building looked different. The windows had been cleaned. The Confederate flag that had flown near the entrance was gone. The doors opened, and Sarah Jenkins walked out. She looked tired, but she was smiling. She wore a tailored suit now, and she carried herself with a new confidence. She wasn't just a public defender anymore. She was the interim district attorney, appointed to clean up the mess Sterling left behind. "Agent Thorne," she said, sitting next to him. "Or do you prefer Marcus?" "Marcus is fine," he smiled. "You didn't have to come back," she said. "I had to check on the patient," Thorne gestured to the courthouse. "How is she doing?" "Better," Sarah said. "We're reviewing every case Vance touched in the last 10 years. We've already exonerated 40 people. The land deeds are being returned. It's a lot of work, but the air feels different." "And Deputy Miller?" "Took a plea. 5 years. He's testifying against the sheriff next week." Thorne nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of gum, offering a piece to her. "You know," Sarah said, looking at the statue of Lady Justice in the square, "I almost quit the day you came in. I was so tired of losing. I was so tired of being afraid of him." "But you didn't quit," Thorne said. That's the point. Evil only wins when good people get tired. Where to next? Sarah asked. Another undercover job? Another corrupt town? Thorne stood up, adjusting his sunglasses. There's always another town, Sarah. There's always someone who thinks they're above the law, and someone has to remind them they aren't. He shook her hand. Take care of this place, Sarah. I will. Thorne walked down the steps of the courthouse, his limp long gone, his stride strong and steady. He got into his black SUV, started the engine, and drove out of Oakhaven. Back in secure hold, in a lonely cell in Block D, Harrison Vance stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the life he had stolen, realizing that his sentence had only just begun. That is the story of how Judge Harrison Vance met the one defendant he couldn't bully, and how Special Agent Marcus Thorne proved that justice might be blind, but it definitely isn't deaf. It's a terrifying thought that power like Vance's exists, but it's a reminder that no one is untouchable. The higher you build your throne on the backs of others, the harder you fall when the foundation crumbles. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes justice and ultimate karma, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about corrupt officials getting exactly what they deserve, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What do you think? Was Vance's punishment enough? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next case.